In this video, I'll give you a bunch of tips you might not expect for getting into miniature painting for the first time. I made a video about 8 years ago, maybe 8.5 years ago from this point, about tips for beginning painters. And over the years, it's gotten a decent number of views, about 215,000 as of this recording. But now we're in the future, aren't we? It's 2025, and the miniature painting hobby is very different than it used to be. Now, you may say, well, it's still paints and brushes and whatnot. Yes, but there's new types of paint and new types of brushes and a bunch of other things to bring people into painting miniature figures. So I wanted to make a new updated beginner guide for 2025 to help get more people into miniature painting. This isn't really going to be like a tutorial, right, that shows you step-by-step type of stuff. It's going to be more of a list of things that you, as a beginning miniature painter, will probably want to do a little bit of research, look into, and try. And then, some of the reasons why I think that you should. Therefore, even painters that aren't that new might also want to check out this video as well. And also, if you have a friend that's thinking about getting into painting miniatures for whatever reason, then you could share this video with them and hopefully it'll help to get them started. When you first start, you don't know what you don't know, so it can be kind of hard to know what things to look up online. They always tell you to thin your paints, and with some paints, I'd say that's true. When I made a video like this 8 years ago, I told you to thin your paints. But nowadays, there's kind of an asterisk after that tip. Nowadays, there's speed paints and contrast paints and all kinds of other transparent, one-coat-done style paints that are generally not meant to be thinned. You're supposed to kind of slop the paints on and then let it collect in the deeper crevices and such to turn into shadows and whatnot. Now, you can thin those paints if you're looking for a more transparent effect, but they're generally meant to be used as is. Usually the thin your paints sentiment is something said more about opaque acrylic paints, and it's because if you put the paint on too thick, then it can dry kind of chalky or bumpy, or it can fill in a little details on the model. However, I've found I don't bother to thin Army Painter Fanatic opaque paints when I put them on as a base layer, because you can just keep spreading them, and they cover really well as you do that, but they don't lay too thickly on the surface. You can add some paint, a glob of paint on there, not watered down, and just keep spreading it and moving it over the surface until you have a nice thin layer of it all over, and it covers really, really well. If you want them to be more transparent, the Fanatic paints, like for glazing or something on later, they'll do that pretty well as well. When you're beginning, it all comes down to trying things so you can start to understand them. Even a little bit of practice will help take away doubt about whether you can paint or not, or even like what kind of painting that you want to do going forward. Nearly anyone can paint, right? Even if it's just to like a very simple paint scheme kind of degree. If you're going to practice, don't practice on your expensive Space Marines from the game store that you just bought or anything like that. Practice on, honestly, nearly anything else. Plastic army men, toys from thrift stores and charity shops, or even dollar store toys. Prime them, let them dry, and then start practicing. Just trying out paint on a brush and pushing it around on some weird plastic figure that you got anywhere but from the game store, right, will allow you to try things out that you won't feel bad about if you screw it up, right? You don't even need to do too much practice, really, just so that you start to feel comfortable painting a small model. If you want to practice for months, absolutely, feel free. But you could also just do it for maybe an hour or two, and if you feel more comfortable, then you could move on to some real miniatures or whatever you want. It's up to you. Once you're relatively comfortable with putting paint onto the models, even if they're like Happy Meal toys or whatever, then it's time to build those fancy models from the game store that I mentioned earlier and start putting paint on them. follow the instructions, clip them all out and all that kind of stuff, glue them all together, and then prime your miniatures. Now, I mentioned priming earlier. It's best if miniatures have a layer of primer on them before you put on paint. It makes the paint stick better. There are 3 main ways to prime your models. You can airbrush primer onto your models, or you can use a spray can of primer as well, like a rattle can, but be advised that both of those, kind of require a bit of a setup. If you're nervous about both of those possibilities, airbrush or rattle can, and you have very limited space, then I'd tell you to try brush-on primer. The Army Painter makes a gray brush-on primer that works really well. Again, you put it onto the model and just keep spreading it around. You don't thin it with water too much, really. It'll cover really well, and if you make sure not to glob too much of the primer into like some of the detail areas in the model and you keep spreading it, then once it's all dry, you'll have a great smooth layer of gray primer to start painting over. That said, I'd tell you not to start with a big fancy miniature. I told you to practice on random toys and army men and stuff like that before, and now that you've done that, you want to start on your actual gaming miniatures that you bought from the game store, right? It's a good idea. However, I would tell you to start with regular troop models first. Now, I understand, like that really cool leader unit looks like really cool or whatever, and that big fancy monster, it sure is neat, right? But you'd be better focusing on the regular troops in your force first. It's like almost another layer of practice, sort of, right? It's finally working on stuff that you'll actually play games with, but it's still kind of a stepping stone. Jumping into a big, expensive model is tempting when you first start out, but you still want to build your skills and not, mess up an expensive miniature. And some of them can be pretty expensive, right? So paint troops first when you first kind of start painting actual gaming models, because that extra level of more practice can be really useful to help build your skills. And also, now is the time in your painting journey to see what kind of painter you are, an assembly line painter or a single model finisher. When I started painting my Tau army, which was my first ever 40K army back 20 years ago, I painted a bunch of them all at once. It just kind of made sense to me, right? Like they were all going to look the same mostly, so why not paint them in an assembly line fashion, right? So I primed them all at once with a red oxide automotive primer rattle can from the parts store, and then I sprayed an orange highlight on all of them at once as well. Why wouldn't I then go and do all the details on each model, with a brush, model after model, like paint all the guns one after another, then paint all the boots one after another, and so on. It turns out some people hate doing it that way. So you need to try to figure out really early on, like if you're painting a group of models that mostly look the same, like a soldier unit or something, like that, where they're all in the same uniform or whatever. You really need to figure out whether you're okay with painting models in an assembly line fashion or whether you prefer painting each model to completion before you start the next one. I would still suggest that you prime them all at once. If you're spraying primer on them, whether you got the airbrush or the rattle can or whatever, you got that out, you might as well do them all at once, or at least that group of them or whatever. But you don't have to if you're just going to be using brush-on primer, right? Because then you could, prime the model and then base coat and then do details and all that stuff all the way till it's done, and then you could go and prime the next one if you wanted. In my opinion, the best way to test what kind of painter you are is to try the assembly line painting first and see if you hate it, right? Like if it seems mind-numbing to paint 3 or 5 models in that way, like everybody's faces and then like everybody's shirts and then everybody's belts and all that kind of stuff, right? Then stop and just do one of the models all the way to the end. So you do the face and the shirt and the pants and do completely to the end and then see if that feels any better to you. If it does, then you should probably continue to do it that way in the future. I really like painting in assembly line style. I feel like I can get, more done, but I can understand how it's not for everybody, right? And it also does to be perfectly frank, kind of have a longer sort of ugly phase, right? Where you sort of have to trust the process. But I feel like I get stuff done quicker, but you should do the way you want to do it. Another important tip, write down your paint recipes. Could be in a notebook, could be in your phone, whatever. Record that stuff. If you're painting armies, especially you want to do this, you probably won't forget like what paints that you used on a unit of models, like while you're painting that unit in assembly line style. You don't get to the third guy with his boots and go, what color am I using? You'll remember it. But if your memory is as bad as mine is, then when you have to paint more models in that same style for another unit in the same army later on, it'll be really nice to know what paints and such that you used during the process. Last year, I added more Necrons to a force that I had painted back in like 2020 when the Indominus box came out, I think. And it was no problem because I had written down the paints that I'd used way back in 2020. Another important tip, learn about slap chop. And don't let people tell you that it's not real miniature painting. The best way to paint your miniatures is the way you like to paint them. Now, that said, I'd look into it and maybe give it a try, see what you think. Just search for slap chop on YouTube and you'll find tons and tons of videos to teach you what it is. I paint honestly most of my miniatures that way, but I use an airbrush instead of a dry brush to get that kind of like light to dark fade that I eventually then cover with transparent speed paint colors and stuff like that, which is kind of what makes it slap chop as far as the internet is concerned. It honestly does work pretty great. Also, don't be afraid of airbrush painting. It's not difficult, messy, or expensive, despite what you might read online. I see a lot of people online who seem to be afraid of airbrushing and therefore they complain about it and are generally against it. I own a couple of different airbrushes, but I own an airbrush and cordless compressor kit that currently sells on Amazon for $55, and it's a great starter setup, right? It's gravity fed, which means that the paint goes in on the top and not on the side, and it's dual action, which means that the trigger goes up and down and also back and forth, and you learn very quickly about what that does. So it's a perfect airbrush setup for miniatures. You can take it anywhere, doesn't take up a bunch of space, it's rechargeable, all that kind of stuff. Get yourself a cardboard box, like a decent sized cardboard box, a respirator mask from the hardware store, one of those with the thingies on the side, and then just use acrylic paints with it, and you won't have to worry about like ventilating it outside or anything. When you start to use things that have fumes like enamels and lacquers, then you want to ventilate. But I never use those paints. I only use regular old acrylics, and so then the ventilator thing that you carry on your face is what keeps the particles from going down inside your throat or in your lungs or whatever. So a box traps it, this thing protects you, and you don't have to worry about fumes. I have an Amazon affiliate link down in the description if you're interested in that little airbrush with the compressor and all that stuff that's all battery powered and everything. It's cheaper than a unit of 3 Blade Guard veterans. Honestly, it can simply just help you with your priming for your miniatures if that's all you want it to do. If you live somewhere like I do, where it's difficult to prime miniatures outside with a spray can because of either cold or humidity or rain or whatever, then using an airbrush and some airbrush primer will allow you to prime miniatures whenever you want. And after you've gotten used to doing that, then it's just basically a very easy step to start airbrushing on your base colors onto your miniatures, right? And then painting the rest of the miniature with detail on your brushes and stuff like that. Or even just doing a zenithal prime for slap chop, like I mentioned before, if that's what you prefer. Last tips, and I think they're important ones. Understand that you are just starting out and you're going to need to have some patience. It takes time and practice to learn to be a better painter. It takes time and practice to learn to be a better anything, right? Like, don't compare yourself to the models that you see people post online, Instagram, Facebook, whatever, and then, get yourself all discouraged because your stuff doesn't look like that. Instead, just compare your current painted miniature to your previous painted miniatures. If you're getting even a little bit better as you paint more, then you're still making progress. Progress is important. Also, if you're wondering where to start with paints and brushes and stuff like that, the Army Painter has an amazing starter set that's only $40 retail. It includes white, black, red, green, blue, yellow, and brown, and a brown transparent wash, and silver and gold metallics, and even a bottle of that brush-on primer that I mentioned earlier. Plus, it comes with a miniature to practice on, and it includes a brush, too. And lastly, there's also a great printed painting guidebook included as well. You can get it at your local shop if they carry it, or if they don't, or if you don't have a local shop near you, use my code down in the description below to get it for 5% off from the Army Painter website. Miniature painting is a great hobby, and even if you don't play war games, you can still enjoy it. A lot of board games have tons and tons of miniatures in them these days, so you could paint those if you were into board gaming. And there's also miniatures that you can use in role-playing games as well if you want to. Or maybe you just like having the miniatures around to look at, and you enjoy the painting process. I personally find it stress-relieving and almost meditative to paint miniatures. So I hope that these tips help you to get started in miniature painting. And if you're watching this as a seasoned painting veteran and you think that I missed something that should be said to people who are just starting, into the hobby, then let us all know what those things are down in the comments below. If you liked this type of video, I would definitely be very happy if you would do some depressmentation of the like button down there as well, where the comments are, and also the subscribe button, which you could click on to see more videos like this every single Friday, and it's free. Thanks for watching.